E. Cummings is an interesting 20th century poet. The phrase avant-garde is sometimes used to describe his poetry. Avant-garde is a French phrase. Avant means before or in front of. Garde, in its most literal sense, refers to the front line of an army. So avant-garde literally means being out in front of the front lines. In an artistic sense, avant-garde means being out in front of tradition. We use this term in music, art, literature, all of the disciplines in the humanities, to refer to those folks who throw away traditional rules and try to create new ways of expressing themselves. And we'll see when we start looking at E. Cummings' poetry that it is pretty different from anything we've seen so far. Cummings was born into a well-to-do family. As I talk about him, I'll show you some pictures. The first major event of his life was serving in France in World War I. All wars are ghastly, but World War I was the first modern war. It was the first war in which lots of casualties were civilians. Lots of poison gas was used. Tanks were used for the first time, airplanes, and all those technological things increased the carnage. Cummings was an ambulance driver, though he didn't do a lot of it. He developed a strong anti-war sentiment early on, expressed that in letters, and got into big trouble. He spent 3.5 months in a French military prison. And this experience, among other things, caused him to think about conventions of all kinds. Conventional ways of thinking about anything, about war, about country, about alliances, about priorities. Not to oversimplify, but Cummings felt that we are so boxed into conventional thinking that we can't see truth when it comes up and punches us in the nose. He felt that World War I was totally crazy, that millions of people were being killed because governments were stupidly committed to rigid, uninformed, traditional thought patterns. So all of this pushed him towards a type of poetic expression that broke down traditional ways of writing, of using language. If you can think about E. Cummings in that way, his poems make more sense. The second major thing that happened to Cummings was that his parents were in a terrible car crash in 1926. He was 32, maybe. They were in a car and got hit broadside by a train. His mother was seriously injured but survived, and his father was killed gruesomely, torn in half by the train. This, of course, was a traumatic thing for someone who was already kind of out there in left field. It intensified Cummings' belief that we live in little bubbles of artificial stability, and we try to shield ourselves from life's great truths. He wanted to use his poetry to try to puncture those artificial bubbles of stability that we try to construct. He wanted his poetry to get us out of our comfort zones, to try to see things in different ways. A small example of this is his unusual use of capitalization. He frequently doesn't capitalize names, for example. What's so important about a name? He frequently doesn't capitalize the first word of a line or a sentence unless it's important. It's just one way in which he tries to nudge us out of our conventional expectations. I suppose we might say that E. Cummings is something of a nature poet. He thinks we ought to pay more attention to nature and natural things, and place less value on man-made things, whether they be shopping malls or political alliances. Well, I think that's enough introductory information. Let's look at some poems and see what we can make of them.